A week after burying my husband, my son and daughter-in-law sat me down for dinner. They told me to grieve, pack my bags, and never come back. My own son, Daniel, just smiled. They even claimed my home was never truly mine. My world shattered, but amidst the devastation, a quiet resolve began to bloom. I simply smiled back, knowing a storm was brewing. Listen to my story, like and share, and let us know where you are listening from. The scent of stale flowers still lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of the funeral that had just taken place a week prior. Eleanor moved through her days in a fog, each breath a conscious effort, each moment stretched thin by the immense, aching emptiness that Arthur's death had left behind. Her beloved Arthur gone. 6 decades of shared laughter, quiet companionship, and unwavering support now reduced to memories that felt both precious and painfully out of reach. The house, once a bustling sanctuary of life, now echoed with a silence that screamed his absence. Every object, every photograph whispered his name, deepening the chasm of her grief. She felt adrift, lost in a sea of sorrow, barely tethered to reality. That evening, Daniel, her son, and Chloe, her daughter-in-law, arrived for what she naively believed would be a comforting family dinner. She had cooked Arthur's favorite roast, hoping the familiar aroma might evoke a sense of warmth, a fleeting moment of normalcy in her shattered world. But the meal was anything but comforting. The air around the dining table was thick with an unspoken tension, heavier than the grief that already pressed down on Eleanor's chest. Daniel picked at his food, his gaze avoiding hers, while Chloe maintained a stiff, almost imperious posture, her eyes sharp and unsettlingly cold. Conversation died almost as soon as it began, punctuated only by the clinking of cutlery, each sound amplified in the suffocating quiet. Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach, a premonition of something unpleasant hanging in the balance. Then, Chloe, without preamble, without a shred of empathy, dropped the bombshell. Her voice, usually carefully modulated, was crisp and devoid of warmth. "Now that your husband is dead," she began, her words slicing through the silence like shards of glass, "it's time you grieve, pack your bags, and never come back." Eleanor felt the world tilt on its axis. Her fork clattered against her plate, the sound startlingly loud in the sudden stillness. She stared at Chloe, her mind struggling to process the brutality of the statement. It had to be a cruel joke, a misunderstanding born from her own grief-addled brain. She turned her gaze to Daniel, her son, her own flesh and blood, desperately searching for a flicker of protest, a hint of outrage at his wife's monstrous words. But Daniel simply offered a weak, almost imperceptible smile, a slight nod of his head that confirmed his wife's cruel decree. In that moment, the world didn't just tilt, it shattered. Chloe, emboldened by Daniel's silent complicity, pressed on, her voice laced with a triumphant edge. "And frankly," she added, her eyes sweeping around the familiar dining room, as if assessing its worth, "this house was never really yours anyway." The words hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. The grief that had been a dull ache now erupted into a searing pain, twisting her insides. Her vision blurred, the familiar patterns of the wallpaper seeming to swim before her eyes. The home she had shared with Arthur for 40 years, the place where they had raised Daniel, where countless memories were woven into the very fabric of the walls. It was all being snatched away, dismissed as if it held no personal significance. Her understanding of her family, of her son, splintered into 1,000 pieces. How could they? How could her own son stand by, silently endorsing such cold-blooded cruelty, just a week after his father's burial? Chloe, oblivious to the profound hurt she inflicted, continued, "You have 2 weeks. 2 weeks to gather your things and find somewhere else to go. 2 weeks, not 2 months, not a reasonable timeline to navigate the profound shock and sorrow of recent widowhood. 2 weeks to erase a lifetime." The sheer audacity, the heartless lack of consideration, was staggering. The betrayal from Daniel, however, cut deeper than Chloe's blunt cruelty. His indifference, the vacant look in his eyes as he averted her gaze, was far more agonizing than any anger or hatred he could have shown. Anger she could have understood, perhaps even fought. But this apathy, this chilling detachment, was a wound that festered immediately. It spoke volumes of a son she no longer recognized, a stranger who valued property more than his grieving mother. Eleanor rose from the table, her legs feeling like lead, each step a testament to her shock. She didn't argue, didn't plead. What words could possibly penetrate such callousness? She simply retreated, a ghost in her own home, making her way slowly to her bedroom. The door closed softly behind her, sealing her off from the heartless pair downstairs. She collapsed onto her bed, the soft quilt offering little comfort against the cold despair that enveloped her. The shock was overwhelming, a paralyzing force that made coherent thought impossible. Losing Arthur had been unthinkable. Losing her home, her sanctuary, her very connection to him, on top of it all, felt like a cruel cosmic joke. The memories, the laughter, the quiet evenings spent reading by the fireplace, all of it threatened to become homeless, rootless. As the initial wave of shock began to recede, replaced by a dull ache of profound sorrow, something unexpected began to stir within Eleanor. Amidst the ashes of her grief and the ruins of her family, a small, hard kernel of determination, like a tiny seed pushing through barren earth, started to bloom. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a cold, precise resolve. She thought of Arthur, her pragmatic, meticulous Arthur. He had been a man of order, his affairs always in perfect shape, every document filed, every account balanced to the penny. He had always handled their finances, a task she had happily left to him, trusting implicitly. A spark ignited in her eyes, banishing for a moment the haze of tears. She would not simply grieve and disappear. She would not allow them to cast her aside like an unwanted relic. She would investigate meticulously, just as Arthur would have done. She would delve into every account, every legal document, every shred of paper that pertained to their life together. She would find out exactly what she was entitled to, what Arthur had left for her. And she would make sure that Daniel and Chloe received a surprise, one they would never forget. The 10 days following that devastating dinner had passed in a blur of surreal quietude. Daniel and Chloe had, true to their word, begun to treat Eleanor as if she were already gone, a ghost haunting her own home. She heard them in the living room, their voices hushed but distinct, planning renovations, discussing color schemes, and even arguing over new furniture. They moved through the house with an air of proprietorship, measuring walls and leafing through design magazines, utterly oblivious to her presence, or perhaps simply indifferent. Eleanor remained largely confined to her bedroom, emerging only for the bare necessities. A strange numbness had settled over her, muffling the sharp edges of grief and betrayal, allowing her to function without completely breaking down. It was this numbness, paradoxically, that gave her the strength to face the daunting task ahead: Arthur's finances. Arthur, bless his methodical soul, had always handled their money. He enjoyed the spreadsheets, the meticulous balancing of books, the calm assurance of knowing their affairs were in perfect order. Eleanor had trusted him implicitly, content to manage the household and their shared life, leaving the complex world of investments and accounts to his capable hands. Now, without him, it felt like deciphering an ancient, forgotten language. Yet, the small, hard kernel of determination that had stirred within her remained. She would not be helpless. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Eleanor found herself behind the wheel of her car, making the familiar journey to First National Bank. It was a route she had traversed countless times over the past 20 years, always with Arthur beside her, usually chatting about the weather or their upcoming plans. Today, the silence in the car was profound, broken only by the hum of the engine. The imposing stone building of the bank loomed ahead, a bastion of stability in her unstable world. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor pushed open the heavy glass doors, stepping into the hushed, air-conditioned interior. She approached the reception desk and asked to speak with Brenda Davies, their longtime bank manager. Brenda, a woman with kind eyes and a reassuring demeanor, emerged from her office within moments. Her face softened with sympathy as she saw Eleanor. "Eleanor, my dear," Brenda said, extending a warm hand, "I am so terribly sorry for your loss. Arthur was a wonderful man." Her condolences, though heartfelt, brought a fresh sting of tears to Eleanor's eyes. Brenda led Eleanor into her comfortable office, offering her a seat and a glass of water. "Now, let's see what we can do to help you navigate this," Brenda said gently, pulling up Arthur's accounts on her computer. She began to list them: The joint checking account, the general savings, their retirement fund. Everything seemed to be in order, just as Eleanor expected. There was a substantial sum in the main savings account, more than enough to live comfortably for many years, even without other assets. A wave of relief, fleeting but potent, washed over Eleanor. Perhaps this wouldn't be so difficult after all. Then Brenda paused, her brow furrowing slightly as she scrolled further down the screen. "That's interesting," she murmured, more to herself than to Eleanor. She looked up, a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Eleanor, it appears Arthur set up several other accounts about 5 years ago, and they're all in your name only." Eleanor stared at her, utterly bewildered. "In my name only?" she repeated, her voice a fragile whisper. "But Arthur handled everything. He never mentioned any separate accounts for me." A sudden chill snaked down her spine. Arthur, her honest, transparent Arthur, keeping secrets? It didn't make sense. Brenda's expression became more guarded, professional. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a lower, more confidential tone. "Sometimes clients establish separate accounts for various reasons, Eleanor. Often it's for estate planning or to protect certain assets. Sometimes when there are complex family dynamics or concerns about inheritance disputes down the line, an individual might take steps to ensure specific beneficiaries are financially secure without complication." The words hung in the air, loaded with unspoken meaning. Complex family dynamics, inheritance disputes. A sudden, vivid memory flashed in Eleanor's mind. 5 years ago, precisely. Chloe had insisted on a lavish trip to Europe, demanding Daniel pay for it despite their already strained budget. Arthur had grumbled privately to Eleanor, expressing subtle concerns about Chloe's extravagant spending habits and Daniel's alarming lack of financial savviness. He had worried about their son's susceptibility to Chloe's influence, his inability to say no. Could this be it? Could Arthur, in his quiet, methodical way, have foreseen something like this? The realization hit Eleanor with the force of a tidal wave. Brenda continued to click through the computer, a small smile playing on her lips. "Well, these accounts are certainly substantial, Eleanor. There are 2 certificates of deposit, a very healthy money market account, and an irrevocable trust account established with you as the sole beneficiary." She paused, allowing the gravity of the information to sink in. "These accounts total a significant sum, far more than your joint savings." Eleanor felt a gasp catch in her throat. Her mind reeled. Arthur had not only kept these accounts a secret from her, but he had also made them substantial, ensuring her complete financial independence. He had done it without fanfare, without a word, simply and efficiently. Brenda then produced a stack of papers from a file. "And here are the opening documents for each of these. You'll see your signature on all of them." Eleanor looked down at the forms. Indeed, her looping signature was there, clear as day, on each one. She remembered signing papers over the years, routine bank documents Arthur would present to her, saying, "Do need your signature on this, dear, for the quarterly reports." She had signed them without a second thought, trusting him completely. He had used her trust, not to deceive her, but to shield her, to build a fortress around her financial future. A profound realization washed over Eleanor. Arthur, her beloved Arthur, had systematically, quietly, and completely protected her. He had understood the potential for what might happen, perhaps even foreseen the cold-hearted ultimatum from Daniel and Chloe. He had loved her so deeply, so foresightedly, that he had built this safety net, ensuring she would never be left vulnerable. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude, of awe for the man she had loved. Just as Eleanor was absorbing the magnitude of Arthur's secret legacy, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, and a bitter smile touched her lips. It was Daniel. "Mom," the text read, "Chloe and I are meeting with the realtor next week to list the house. Make sure your things are packed." He was still oblivious, still operating under the assumption that she was powerless, that he held all the cards. But Eleanor now knew something Daniel and Chloe didn't, and that knowledge, that profound realization, was a weapon she hadn't even known she possessed. Bolstered by the revelation of Arthur's foresight at the bank, Eleanor knew her next step. Arthur's construction business, Arthur Construction, had been his pride and joy, a legacy he had built from the ground up. Daniel had always maintained that the business had been sold years ago, barely covering its debts, a narrative Eleanor had accepted without question. But now, doubt, sharp and insistent, gnawed at her. She had a new resolve, a quiet strength born from her husband's secret protectiveness. The following morning, Eleanor drove to the offices of Morrison and Associates, the accounting firm that had handled Arthur's business affairs for decades. She requested an appointment with Sarah Jenkins, Arthur's trusted accountant for the past 15 years. Sarah was a woman of sharp intellect and discreet professionalism, with a keen eye for detail. When Eleanor was ushered into her office, Sarah's face reflected genuine sorrow. "Eleanor, my deepest condolences on Arthur's passing," she said, her voice soft. "He was truly one of my most respected clients." After offering her sympathies, Sarah began to speak of Arthur Construction, her tone shifting to business. As she did, a hint of surprise colored her expression. "I'm surprised Arthur never discussed the business's current status with you, Eleanor. He always spoke so highly of you." Eleanor felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. "Daniel told me years ago that Arthur had sold the business," she explained, trying to keep her voice even. "He said it was a difficult sale, barely enough to cover some lingering debts. I just assumed that was the end of it." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly, a clear indication of disbelief. "Sold? No, Eleanor, that's quite incorrect. Arthur Construction was certainly not sold. It was, however, restructured about 5 years ago. Arthur had a very clear vision for its future." She turned to her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "He placed the entire business into a trust, a very specific kind of trust, designed to ensure its longevity and stability." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. A trust? Why had she known nothing about this? "And who is the beneficiary of this trust?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, a strange premonition taking hold. Sarah turned from her computer, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "You are, Eleanor. You are the primary beneficiary and effectively the owner of the trust. It was set up so that all profits flowed directly to the trust, which then distributes them to you." Arthur was very clear about his intentions. The revelation left Eleanor momentarily speechless. First the secret bank accounts, now a thriving business, disguised as a sold-off failure. The sheer depth of Arthur's planning was astounding. "But I thought the business was struggling," Eleanor finally managed to say, remembering Daniel's narrative. Sarah shook her head. "Quite the contrary. Under David Miller, the foreman Arthur put in charge, the company has been consistently profitable. Year after year. David is an excellent manager. He runs a tight ship, and the clients are very loyal. Arthur always kept a close eye on the books, of course, but he was very pleased with David's work." Eleanor felt a surge of emotions, confusion, gratitude, and a growing sense of awe for her late husband. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked, the question tinged with a faint ache. "Why all the secrecy?" Sarah hesitated, carefully choosing her words. "Arthur was a very private man when it came to certain financial matters, Eleanor. He confided in me that he was concerned about family pressures. He wanted to ensure your financial security, free from any complications." As Sarah spoke, Eleanor remembered more conversations, fragmented worries Arthur had expressed over the years. Chloe's insatiable desire for designer clothes and lavish vacations, her constant pushing for bigger, better, more. Daniel's chronic inability to hold down a stable, well-paying job, his tendency to rely on his parents for handouts. It all clicked into place. Arthur had worried that if they knew about the business's continued success, Daniel and Chloe would demand a share, bleeding the company dry and leaving Eleanor vulnerable. He was concerned, Sarah continued, her gaze direct, that Daniel's financial struggles, combined with Chloe's expensive tastes, would lead to demands on the business's income, potentially destabilizing it and affecting your future security. He wanted to protect you from that and from them. A profound understanding settled over Eleanor. Arthur wasn't just protecting her from destitution. He was protecting her from the very people who were now trying to evict her from her home. And then another realization, colder and sharper, pierced through her. "All those times Daniel asked us for money," she murmured, more to herself than to Sarah. "Arthur always said he was lending it to him. I thought it was from our personal savings." Sarah cleared her throat. Actually, Eleanor, those funds didn't come from your personal accounts. Arthur, in his wisdom, structured them as loans directly from the business account. He had me draw up formal loan agreements, complete with payment, schedules, and interest rates for each transaction. She opened a thick file on her desk, pulling out a stack of neatly organized documents. Here are copies of them. Eleanor picked up the first document, her eyes scanning the official-looking papers. There it was, a loan agreement between Arthur Construction Trust and Daniel, detailing a sum of $30,000 with terms for repayment. Her son's signature was clearly visible at the bottom. And there were more, dozens of them, stretching back years, each one a testament to Daniel's financial dependency and Arthur's meticulous approach. A quick calculation, prompted by Sarah's gentle guidance, revealed the staggering truth. Based on these records, Eleanor, Sarah stated, Daniel currently owes Arthur Construction approximately $87,000 in arrears, including accumulated interest. He hasn't made a payment in nearly 2 years. Eleanor's hand trembled as she put down the documents. $87,000, her own son. He hadn't just been leeching off his parents. He had been formally indebted to a business he didn't even know existed in her name. As if the revelations weren't enough, Sarah added another layer of disbelief. And actually, Eleanor, Daniel contacted me last month. He asked me to prepare documents for a transfer of ownership, assuming he would be taking over Arthur Construction. I explained to him that as the business was held in trust, he couldn't simply take over. He seemed rather put out. I told him he would need to speak with you. Eleanor's mind raced. Daniel hadn't just intended to claim her home. He had planned to usurp her rightful inheritance, to seize control of a profitable business he believed was his by right, despite owing it a substantial sum. He truly believed he was entitled to everything. A cold, hard resolve solidified in Eleanor's heart. Arthur had built these protections for a reason, and now she understood why. The sun, bright and unwavering, streamed through the kitchen window the next morning, but it did little to dispel the chill that had settled in Eleanor's home. She sat at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea, the stack of documents from Sarah Jenkins spread out before her. The weight of Arthur's foresight, combined with the sting of Daniel and Chloe's betrayal, had fueled a sleepless night, but also a quiet resolve. She had one more crucial person to speak with, David Miller. Just as the clock chimed 8, a knock sounded at her back door. David, Arthur's longtime foreman, stood on the porch, his rugged face etched with worry. He was a man of few words, built like an oak tree, with an unshakable loyalty that Arthur had always valued. "Mrs. Eleanor," he began, his voice gruff but kind, "thank you for calling me. I've been worried sick since Mr. Arthur passed." Eleanor ushered him in, offering him a fresh cup of coffee. As he settled at the table, his eyes scanned the documents. "It's about the business, isn't it?" he asked, cutting straight to the point. "Daniel's been circling like a vulture, if you'll excuse my language." Eleanor's grip tightened on her teacup. "He has?" David nodded, his jaw set. "Oh yes, the day after the funeral, he was already calling, talking about evaluating assets and streamlining operations. He asked me for everything, a complete list of current contracts, equipment inventory, cash flow projections, and even the keys to the yard in the main office." David paused, his gaze meeting Eleanor's. "I told him I couldn't provide any of it without explicit instruction from the legal owner. Mr. Arthur had very specific instructions about who to report to." A wave of relief washed over Eleanor, mixed with a deeper appreciation for Arthur's meticulous planning. David's unwavering loyalty was a testament to the kind of man Arthur had been. "And did you give him anything?" she asked, a tremor in her voice. David shook his head firmly. "Not a single thing, Mrs. Eleanor. Mr. Arthur always said, 'David, you answer to the owner. And if anything ever happens to me, you make sure you only answer to the rightful owner, and only when they present proof.'" He was a very careful man, as you know. Eleanor pushed the trust documents across the table. "Well, David," she said, a small, wry smile touching her lips, "I believe I have that proof." She watched as David's eyes widened, his gaze sweeping over the official-looking papers, his expression shifting from confusion to astonishment, and finally to a profound understanding. "Mrs. Eleanor," he breathed, shaking his head in disbelief, "Mr. Arthur really was something else. He truly was. He looked at her, a newfound respect in his eyes. So you own the business now. All this time, I had no idea. Neither did I, David, Eleanor admitted, a bitter laugh escaping her. Neither did I. She explained Sarah Jenkins's revelations, the secret accounts in the hidden trust. Arthur, she concluded, was protecting me from Daniel and Chloe. David simply nodded, his features grim. It makes sense. He worried about them. He loved Daniel, of course, but he knew he was easily influenced. And Chloe, well, she always wanted more than Daniel could provide. Mr. Arthur worked too hard to see it all squandered. He leaned back, crossing his arms. The business is in excellent shape, Mrs. Eleanor. Good reputation, solid contracts, and a healthy profit margin. We're busy, even in this economy. Eleanor felt a surge of pride, both for Arthur and for David. I want you to continue managing it, David, she said, her voice firm. Exactly as you have been. I trust you completely. A look of immense relief flooded David's face. Thank you, Mrs. Eleanor. That means a great deal. He then paused, his expression growing serious again. You know, Daniel often came around. Not just after Mr. Arthur passed. He'd show up at the yard, asking about cash flow, suggesting the business could help him out with various investment opportunities. Always vague, always pressing. Eleanor felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Did he ever get anything? David hesitated. Mr. Arthur handled all the finances, Mrs. Eleanor, but I did see Daniel leave with checks sometimes. And once, about 6 months ago, I was at the bank making a large deposit from a big project we just completed. Daniel happened to show up at the teller window right next to me, just minutes after I finished. He feigned surprise, said it was just a coincidence, but his eyes, he was watching how much I was depositing. He definitely knows the business is profitable. Probably not the full extent, though, because Mr. Arthur always kept the business finances separate from everything else. Eleanor's mind raced. So Daniel hadn't just been guessing. He had been actively sniffing around, looking for an opportunity to siphon funds. He knew the business was a cash cow, ripe for the taking. I've got some records, too, from my end, David continued, pulling out a worn notebook from his satchel. Arthur always had me keep detailed logs of any money going out to Daniel, just in case. He called them payments. They were structured as loans, but I don't think he ever really enforced them. Over the last 5 years, he's received about $93,000 in total. David flipped through the pages. He always signed for them, though. Mr. Arthur was meticulous about that. $93,000, even more than Sarah had estimated. Eleanor felt a knot of anger tighten in her chest. Her son had been systematically bleeding his father's business, all while claiming it was a financial failure. The audacity, the sheer greed was breathtaking. Just as Eleanor was absorbing this new information, a loud slam echoed from outside. A car door, and then footsteps on the porch. Daniel. Eleanor and David exchanged a startled glance. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. Daniel was here now, unexpectedly, catching them in the middle of their revealing conversation. The game, it seemed, was about to begin. If you're gripped by Eleanor's quiet strength and Arthur's incredible foresight, then you won't want to miss a single moment of what happens next. The truth is starting to unravel, and trust me, it gets even better. Keep watching to see this story unfold. Hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe so you don't miss any more parts of this unexpected tale. The loud slam of the car door was still echoing when Daniel strode into the kitchen, not bothering to knock. His presence instantly sucked the air out of the room, replacing the quiet confidence Eleanor had just begun to feel with a familiar tension. He barely glanced at David, offering a perfunctory nod before his eyes began to sweep around the kitchen. It wasn't a look of affection or nostalgia, but a calculating assessment, as if he were already mentally listing renovations, preparing the space for a new owner. His gaze lingered on the antique hutch, then the well-worn farmhouse table, each piece of furniture a memory to Eleanor, but merely a resale opportunity to him. Eleanor, despite the sudden jolt of his unannounced arrival, managed to keep her expression smooth, masking the deep conversation she and David had just been having. "Daniel, what a surprise," she said, her voice even. "David just stopped by to offer his condolences and check in on me." It was a half-truth, but enough to deflect immediate suspicion. Daniel finally deigned to acknowledge David, a patronizing smile gracing his lips. Ah, Miller, good. Saves me a trip out to the yard. He turned back to Eleanor, his tone dismissive. Mom, would you mind making some fresh coffee? David and I need to discuss some technical details about the business. The implication was clear. Leave the men to their important matters. Before Eleanor could even process his instruction, Daniel turned his full attention to David, his posture radiating a newfound authority. Look, Miller, now that Dad's gone, there are going to be some changes. Chloe and I are taking over the estate. I'll be handling all of Dad's business affairs going forward. So I'll need you to prepare a full inventory of all current projects, equipment, and a detailed financial report. And the keys to everything, of course. He spoke with an air of entitlement, as if these were foregone conclusions, his birthright. David, however, remained impassive, his expression carefully neutral. His eyes, usually warm, now held a glint of steel. And who exactly is making these decisions, Daniel? He asked, his voice low and steady. The question, so simple, carried a surprising weight, challenging Daniel's assumption of automatic control. Daniel, clearly unaccustomed to being questioned, especially by an employee, bristled. His initial confidence faltered for a fraction of a second. The family, of course, he retorted, his voice rising slightly. As Arthur Henderson's son and heir, I'll be handling Dad's business affairs going forward. It's only natural. He puffed out his chest, attempting to regain his lost composure. David didn't waver. His gaze was unwavering, his tone still politely insistent. Will you now? He asked, the subtle emphasis on will carrying a world of meaning. And on what legal authority will you be doing that, Daniel? Mr. Arthur was very particular about his business, as you know. Everything was always above board, legally sound. Daniel's face began to flush. He hadn't anticipated this resistance from David, whom he likely viewed as a loyal but simple employee. He looked at Eleanor as if expecting her to intervene, to smooth things over. Mom, really, the coffee, he urged, his tone taking on an impatient edge, clearly expecting her to retreat and allow him to assert his dominance. But something had shifted within Eleanor. The numbness she had felt for days had dissipated, replaced by a quiet, determined resolve. The image of Arthur, meticulously safeguarding her future, filled her with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She met Daniel's gaze, her own eyes steady. I'll stay. Thank you, she said, her voice calm but firm. This is my kitchen, and David is my guest. We were just having a conversation. The words hung in the air, a startling declaration from a woman who had, for years, deferred to Daniel and Chloe, who had always sought to avoid conflict. Daniel stared at her, genuinely surprised, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. He quickly recovered, though, turning back to David with renewed insistence. Look, Miller, I don't have time for this. I need that inventory, and I need access to all the business accounts. The sooner the better. Chloe and I have plans for the property, and we need to get a clear picture of all the assets. David remained unruffled. Understood, Daniel, he said, his voice still level. But again, I'll need proper authorization. Who should I be coordinating with for account access? Is there a lawyer I should speak to, or an executor of the estate that can provide legal instruction? Daniel's confidence, which had been so unwavering moments before, visibly began to waver. He stumbled over his words, struggling to articulate any concrete legal authority beyond his lineage. I am the son, the heir. That's authorization enough. Dad always intended for me to take over the business. He sounded less convincing now, more desperate. He had assumed, as always, that his position as Arthur's son was enough, that inheritance was simply a matter of claiming it. Eleanor watched her son, truly seeing him for the first time in years. He was arrogant, entitled, and utterly unprepared. The weight of Arthur's protection, the layers of his foresight, suddenly felt incredibly powerful. She decided in that moment to cast her lot with David, to stand her ground. Actually, Daniel, Eleanor interjected, her voice cutting through the tense silence. I think David is right to ask for proper documentation. She met Daniel's stunned gaze, holding it firmly. Arthur was very careful with his affairs. Everything was always done by the book. She paused, allowing the full weight of her statement to land. I'm sure you'll be able to provide David with everything he needs. Daniel stared at her, his jaw slack. Disbelief warred with a sudden, dawning comprehension. This wasn't the pliant, grieving mother he had expected. This was a different Eleanor, one who was not only refusing to fall into line, but was actively challenging his authority. For Eleanor, a strange, exhilarating surge of power coursed through her veins. It was terrifying, yes, but also incredibly liberating. The game was truly on. The atmosphere in Eleanor's home felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. 3 days had passed since Daniel's unexpected arrival, and Eleanor's quiet defiance in the kitchen. In those days, Daniel had stewed, and finally his anger had boiled over. His phone call to Eleanor had been tight, clipped, a demand for an immediate meeting. He arrived with Chloe in tow, her face a mask of pinched fury, Daniel's own expression a mixture of indignation and frustration. Eleanor met them at the front door, composed and resolute. She had chosen a dignified navy blue dress, a simple strand of pearls projecting an image of quiet strength rather than vulnerability. As they stormed into the living room, Eleanor maintained her composure, refusing to be intimidated by their aggressive postures and thinly veiled hostility. The power dynamics in the room had shifted, and she felt it keenly. Daniel wasted no time. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Mom?" he demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. "David Miller is refusing to provide me with any information about Dad's business. He says he needs proper authorization." "What did you tell him?" Eleanor's gaze was steady, meeting his without flinching. "I simply told David to follow proper procedures, Daniel," she replied calmly, her voice even. "That's what Arthur would have expected. Everything always had to be done by the book, as you know." Chloe, her patience clearly worn thin, interjected, her voice shrill with indignation. "But Daniel is Arthur's heir. He's the son. That's all the authorization he needs." She looked at Eleanor as if she were a particularly slow child. Eleanor merely arched an eyebrow. "Being an heir, dear, usually comes with legal documentation and actual ownership. Does Daniel have that?" she asked, her tone deceptively mild. The question hung in the air, a challenge. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but Eleanor cut him off, her voice gaining a quiet authority. She reached for a leather-bound folder on the side table, opening it slowly. "Perhaps it's time we cleared a few things up," she said, her eyes moving from Daniel to Chloe. She pulled out the trust documents, the official seals and signatures clearly visible. "Arthur Construction," she announced, her voice resonating with a newfound power, "has not been owned by Arthur Henderson since 2019. It's been owned by the Arthur Construction Trust. And I, Daniel, am the sole beneficiary of that trust." The words struck Chloe and Daniel with the force of a physical blow. Their faces, already flushed with anger, drained of color. Chloe's mouth fell open, a strangled whisper escaping her lips. "This is impossible. You? But you don't know anything about business. Arthur always handled everything." Her disbelief was palpable, her contempt for Eleanor's perceived lack of acumen barely disguised. Eleanor offered a faint, almost pitying smile. "That's quite true, Chloe. I didn't know about the business." Arthur kept it quiet. Her eyes flickered to Daniel, then back to Chloe. "But Arthur, it seems, understood our family situation rather better than any of us realized." Daniel, looking as though the air had been knocked out of him, sank onto the sofa. His bravado had evaporated. "But the business. Dad always said it had tight margins, that it barely broke even most years after expenses. He said that's why he had to sell it." His voice was weak, laced with confusion and a dawning sense of betrayal. Eleanor reached back into the folder, pulling out another set of documents. The annual financial statements for Arthur Construction. She presented them with a flourish. "Actually, Daniel," she said, her voice now firm and unwavering, "Arthur Construction has been remarkably profitable. Here are the statements from the last 5 years. As you can see, the profits have been substantial, year after year, under David Miller's excellent management." She laid them on the coffee table, letting the numbers speak for themselves. Chloe snatched up the papers, her eyes darting over the figures, her face growing paler with each passing moment. Daniel, meanwhile, stared at the wall, a dazed expression on his face. Then Eleanor pulled out the next set of documents, the meticulously detailed loan agreements. She placed them beside the financial statements. "And speaking of finances, Daniel, these are the formal loan agreements between the Arthur Construction Trust and you." She pointed to the final sum. You currently owe the business $87,000 in arrears, including interest. Chloe gasped, her eyes snapping to Daniel, a furious accusation in their depths. $87,000? Daniel, you told me those were gifts, that Arthur was just helping you out. She flung the papers at him. Daniel flinched, shrinking back into the cushions. He never asked for payment, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. He said it was just a way to keep things informal. Arthur was many things, Daniel, but informal with money was never one of them, Eleanor stated, her voice devoid of emotion. As you can see, each loan agreement is meticulously documented with payment schedules and interest rates, and David Miller, the foreman, has even more detailed records of every single payment you received and every payment you missed. Her gaze was unwavering, a cold, hard truth in her eyes. Arthur anticipated all of this. He planned for it. Chloe, seeing their carefully constructed future crumble before her eyes, suddenly tried to shift focus, her voice regaining a desperate edge. Fine, so the business is yours. But the house, Eleanor, this house is worth far more. You can't tell me Arthur put this house in some secret trust too. Eleanor allowed a slow, knowing smile to spread across her lips. The house, Chloe, is indeed very valuable. And you are correct, it's not in a trust. She paused, allowing a moment of false hope to flicker in their eyes. Then she delivered the final devastating blow. However, 18 months ago, Arthur took out a substantial home equity loan of $350,000 on this property. He then transferred the entire proceeds into the trust. Chloe and Daniel stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. They knew Arthur had been the sole legal owner of the house, having bought it before their marriage, thus requiring no one else's signature for any loans or transactions related to it. It meant they had no claim, no leverage. The house, which they believed to be their ultimate prize, was now burdened with a massive debt, its equity gone, secured by a trust that belonged entirely to Eleanor. Eleanor rose, walking slowly to the window, looking out at the familiar garden Arthur had loved. She turned back, her eyes filled with a titillating, resolute clarity. He was protecting me, Daniel, she said, her voice soft but firm, a final explanation hanging in the air. He was protecting me from being thrown out of my own home by family members who saw me as a burden, rather than someone to cherish. The silence that followed Eleanor's final revelation was deafening, broken only by Chloe's ragged breath. Her carefully constructed composure finally shattered, exposing the raw desperation beneath. You manipulated a dying man, Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking with fury, her face contorted. You coerced Arthur into all this, knowing he was frail. This is despicable. Eleanor simply shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. Arthur was many things, Chloe, but easily manipulated was not one of them. He was sharp, clear-headed, and planning for the future, right up until his last moments. He knew exactly what he was doing. Her gaze lingered on Daniel, who sat slumped on the sofa, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Daniel finally spoke, his voice weak, a shadow of its former arrogance. Mom, please. This is the family home. It's always been our intention to keep it in the family. Do you really want to run a construction business? All the stress, the paperwork. He was trying to appeal to her perceived frailty, her supposed lack of business acumen, perhaps hoping she would simply hand over control out of a desire for an easier life. Eleanor looked at him, her expression firm. It is staying in the family, Daniel. It's staying with me. Chloe, ever the pragmatist when it came to money, cut in, her tone laced with a desperate edge of triumph. But how will you afford the mortgage payments on this house, Eleanor? $350,000 is a huge loan. You don't have an income. You'll be forced to sell eventually. She thought she had found a loophole, a final way to claim the house. Eleanor met Chloe's gaze, a knowing glint in her eyes. I will afford it, Chloe. The income from Arthur Construction, which David Miller assures me is stable and more than profitable enough, will cover the payments easily, and then some. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Not only would she keep the house, but the very business they had tried to steal would pay for it. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor rose from her armchair. She walked to the center of the living room, her posture straight, her head held high. Her voice, though soft, carried an undeniable finality. Now, Daniel, Chloe, I think it's time you found somewhere lovely to start fresh, perhaps a new neighborhood, a new beginning. The words were a direct echo of Chloe's cruel ultimatum just days before, delivered with a calm dignity that made them far more impactful. Daniel looked utterly bewildered, his face crumpling. "Mom, why are you doing this to us?" he pleaded, his voice tinged with genuine hurt, as if he were the injured party. He couldn't comprehend her actions, couldn't see beyond his own sense of entitlement. Eleanor looked at her son, a deep sadness in her eyes. "I'm not doing anything to you, Daniel," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "I'm simply refusing to let you do it to me." That was the breaking point for Chloe. With a furious gasp, she sprang to her feet. "This isn't over, Eleanor. We'll fight this. We'll contest everything. You can't just do this." She stormed towards the door, her high heels clicking furiously against the hardwood floor. Eleanor merely inclined her head. "You are absolutely welcome to try, Chloe." Arthur, as you now know, was meticulous. Every document, every account, every transaction has been legally executed and meticulously documented by Sarah Jenkins and her attorney. I assure you, you'll find no fault in his planning. Her calm acceptance of the challenge seemed to deflate Chloe even further, turning her fury into a frustrated, impotent rage. With a final furious glare, Chloe yanked open the front door and stalked out, Daniel scrambling to follow her, his bewildered gaze lingering on his mother. The front door slammed shut, leaving Eleanor in a silence that was profoundly different from the grief-stricken quiet of the past weeks. This silence was one of peace, of hard-won victory. She walked back to her armchair and sat down, a deep sigh escaping her lips. The house, once filled with the ghosts of loss and betrayal, now hummed with a new energy, a sense of quiet triumph. She felt a profound sense of financial independence, a freedom she hadn't truly experienced in decades, having always relied on Arthur's stewardship. He had given her not just money, but autonomy. 6 months later, Eleanor found herself gazing out over the vast, shimmering expanse of the Pacific Ocean from the porch of a beautiful, cozy cottage in Mendocino. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, where wildflowers bloomed in riotous colors along the cliffs and the scent of salt water mingled with redwood. This, too, was Arthur's secret. He had quietly purchased the oceanfront property through the trust, a perfect, peaceful haven for her retirement, a place far from the greedy clutches of Daniel and Chloe. Arthur Construction continued to thrive under David Miller's steadfast management, its profits steadily accumulating in Eleanor's personal accounts. David, ever loyal, sent regular reports and updates, and occasionally Eleanor would visit the site, enjoying the purposeful hum of activity. She hadn't needed to lift a finger, hadn't needed to learn the intricacies of the business. Arthur had simply ensured she would always be cared for. Eleanor often thought of Arthur, a gentle smile on her face. He had been a man of immense foresight and even greater love. He hadn't just planned for her future. He had meticulously built a new life for her, one free from worry and exploitation. He had given her the greatest gift of all, peace. The Mendocino cottage, with its sweeping ocean views and the constant lullaby of the waves, had become Eleanor's sanctuary. 6 months had passed since she had delivered her quiet ultimatum to Daniel and Chloe. The expected legal battle had ensued, long and arduous, but ultimately predictable. Arthur, in his meticulous foresight, had left no stone unturned, no loophole for their greed to exploit. One crisp autumn afternoon, Eleanor's lawyer, Michael Thorne, arrived at the cottage. Michael was a man of quiet competence, sharp as a tack, and with a kind demeanor that belied his formidable legal skills. He had been a tremendous source of support throughout the entire ordeal. He settled into an armchair opposite Eleanor, a thick briefcase beside him. "It's done, Eleanor," he announced, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "The settlement is finalized." Eleanor felt a quiet sense of closure. She had known deep down that Arthur's arrangements were unassailable. The protracted fight had only served to confirm the thoroughness of his planning. Michael explained that the investigation had indeed confirmed all of Arthur's trusts and financial instruments were perfectly legal and executed. In fact, a deeper dive into the business records, cross-referenced with bank statements, had revealed that Daniel's debt to Arthur Construction was even larger than initially thought. With accrued interest and various penalties for late payments, the total now stood at over $96,000. Their attorney tried every angle, Michael recounted, a faint smile playing on his lips. They argued family obligations should supersede business contracts, tried to claim duress on Arthur's part, even attempted to paint you as manipulative. But the documentation, Eleanor, was airtight. Sarah Jenkins and her team are exceptional. He paused, his expression softening. Daniel, he had a meltdown in the final mediation session. He broke down, accused you of destroying your relationship over money. It was quite a scene. Eleanor listened, a pang of sorrow mingling with her resolve. She hadn't wanted to hurt Daniel, but his choices, his actions, had forced her hand. He had chosen money over family, over respect. Ultimately, Michael continued, pulling out a legal document, they had no choice but to concede. The final settlement dictates that Daniel and Chloe will enter into an 8-year payment plan to repay the $96,000 to the Arthur Construction Trust. We've also included provisions for wage garnishment and property liens if they default on any payments. He handed her the signed document. It ensures you'll be repaid, and they can't simply walk away. As Eleanor looked at the formal agreement, a sense of justice, cold and resolute, settled over her. It wasn't about revenge, but about accountability. Michael then reached into his briefcase and produced a single folded piece of paper. Daniel also insisted I give you this, he said, his voice softer. It's a letter. Eleanor took the letter, her fingers brushing the familiar handwriting. She opened it slowly. It was from Daniel. His words were halting, clearly written under duress and the weight of consequences. He spoke of losing almost everything, of the shock and shame. He finally acknowledged Arthur's actions, admitting that perhaps his father had indeed known him better than he, Daniel, had known himself. He apologized, not just for his demands, but for his insensitivity after Arthur's death, for his and Chloe's cruelty. He mentioned that he and Chloe were in marriage counseling, and that he was now working 2 jobs, determined to meet the payment schedule. He expressed a hope for reconciliation, for a chance to rebuild their relationship, shattered by his own greed. Eleanor folded the letter carefully, her expression unreadable. The apology, while perhaps genuine in its current motivation, felt 6 months too late. It had come only after he had faced the stark reality of his choices, after he had lost his assumed inheritance and was faced with substantial debt. It wasn't born of true contrition, but of consequences. She handed the letter back to Michael. No response is needed, she said, her voice firm. If Daniel truly wishes to rebuild our relationship, he must do it gradually, consistently, and over time, just like he'll be paying off his debt. Her words carried the weight of experience, the wisdom earned through hardship. A few weeks later, a different call came, one that brought an unexpected purpose to Eleanor's new life. It was Laura Jenkins, Sarah's daughter, a kind-hearted nurse Eleanor had known since Laura was a girl. Laura explained that she ran a support group for women who had experienced financial manipulation or exploitation by family members. Your story, Eleanor, Laura said gently. It's an inspiration. Would you ever consider coming to speak to the group, just to share your journey? Eleanor sat by the window looking out at the endless ocean. She thought of her journey, from a grieving widow facing homelessness and betrayal, to a woman who had, through her late husband's love and foresight, found not just financial independence, but a profound inner strength. She thought of Arthur's meticulous planning, not as an act of revenge, but of protection. Yes, Laura, Eleanor replied, a quiet certainty in her voice. I would love to speak to your group. She wouldn't speak of revenge, she decided. She would speak of boundaries, of the importance of financial literacy, and of Arthur's incredible gift, the gift of protection, of freedom, and the courage to stand strong. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Eleanor raised a glass of wine. To you, Arthur, she whispered, her voice filled with profound gratitude. Thank you, my love, for everything. She finally understood what true freedom meant, not just financial security, but the peace of knowing she was living a life on her own terms, empowered by a love that transcended even death.